She was just a waitress in a glittering lounge of millionaires. Quiet, invisible, forgotten. Until one night, a smug billionaire singled her out and forced her to play the piano in front of everyone. To humiliate her. But when her fingers touched the keys, the room froze. And what happened next exposed a buried truth no one was ready for. Why did the music bring Richard Langston to tears, and who was the mystery woman watching from the back of the room? The Velvet Crown was not just any lounge, it was where the city's most powerful men and women gathered to show off their wealth and drink behind veils of velvet and gold. Every night, it hummed with laughter, jazz, and clinking glasses. And every night, Emily Bennett showed up in her black and white uniform, hair tied back, eyes cast down, serving drinks like a shadow in the corners. She wasn't the type anyone remembered. That's how she liked it. She moved like she was part of the wallpaper, unseen and unbothered, blending in while the world ignored her. But not tonight. Because tonight, Richard Langston was bored. A man with more money than empathy, Richard was known not just for his fortune in real estate, but for the games he played. He was tall, sharp-suited, and ruthless. His ego fed off the discomfort of others. And when his friends didn't entertain him, he found strangers to provoke. That night, Emily caught his eye. It wasn't because she said something wrong or spilled a drink. She was just too quiet. Too calm. Too composed. And Richard hated that. He watched her closely as she poured champagne for a couple in the VIP section, noting the way she moved, how she avoided eye contact. He nudged his friend and whispered something cruel. The friend laughed. Soon, the whole corner booth was watching her, waiting. Emily felt it in the back of her neck. That sickly heat of being watched. She glanced toward them and saw Richard raising his glass with a mocking smile. She turned away, heart fluttering. Something about his grin made her stomach twist. She knew men like that. Men who saw waitresses not as people but as props in their nightly performance. Behind her, the grand piano gleamed in the candlelight. No one had played it in weeks. It was more for decoration than music now. But Richard had a different plan tonight. He leaned back, sipping his wine, and waited for the right moment. Emily continued to work, clearing a table near the bar, trying not to let the tension grow. She was used to being overlooked. But being noticed, especially by someone like him, was worse. Because when men like Richard noticed you, it was never for anything good. At 10:14 p.m., with the room humming and the band on break, Richard stood up and clinked his glass. The crowd quieted. All eyes turned to him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice oozing arrogance. "We've been blessed tonight with more than just fine champagne. Our lovely waitress here," he gestured at Emily, "has a hidden talent I believe we all deserve to enjoy." The room chuckled. Emily froze mid-step, her tray balanced in her hand. "I heard," he continued, smirking, "that she plays piano. Isn't that right, sweetheart?" Murmurs rose. Emily blinked, her breath caught in her throat. Someone must have told him. Or maybe he guessed. But it didn't matter, he was putting her on the spot. "Why don't you give us a little concert?" he said, stepping aside, revealing the piano like it was a trapdoor opening. She shook her head, whispering no too softly for anyone to hear. He laughed. "Come on, don't be shy. I'll make it worth your while." He pulled out a roll of cash and tossed it onto the piano keys with a loud slap. The room burst into amused gasps. Phones were raised. This wasn't just a request anymore. It was a challenge. Un spectacle. A command. Emily stood still, heart racing. Her eyes darted toward the exit, but her legs wouldn't move. Richard crossed his arms and leaned against the piano, waiting. His grin said everything. To him, this was entertainment. To her, it was exposure. Behind her, the velvet walls seemed to close in. And just like that, her past, the one she had buried, was clawing its way back into the room. Emily didn't move right away. Her eyes locked on the piano like it was a grave she'd never wanted to visit again. The laughter around her faded into a soft buzz as her mind drifted backward, to another life she had fought hard to forget. Years ago, in a house that smelled of old books and lavender, there lived a girl who loved the piano more than anything in the world. That girl was Emily. Her mother, Clara, was a piano teacher, gentle and strict, who taught Emily to read sheet music before bedtime stories. Emily's fingers danced across keys before they ever learned to braid hair. Music wasn't just a hobby in their home, it was a language, a world, a heartbeat. By the time Emily turned 12, she was winning regional competitions and being invited to play at formal events. Her future seemed golden, shaped by applause and standing ovations. But behind every great prodigy, there's often a pressure no child should carry. For Emily, it was her father, Mark. He wasn't abusive in the traditional way, but his love was conditional. Praise only came when she won. Silence came when she didn't. Every wrong note echoed louder at home than in any concert hall. At 14, something changed. Emily won a national competition that gave her a scholarship offer to a prestigious academy overseas. But the night she came home to celebrate, she found her mother crying in the kitchen. Her father had gambled away most of their savings. He lost the house. The scholarship covered tuition, but not flights, food, or rent. Her mother begged him to get help. Instead, he disappeared. A week later, he was arrested for embezzlement from his employer. The newspapers plastered their name everywhere. Emily Bennett, the rising star, became the daughter of a criminal. The academy rescinded her invitation. Sponsors pulled their support. Reporters called their home for weeks. Emily stopped playing. Her mother fell into depression. The piano became a reminder of everything they lost. One night, Emily covered it with a black sheet and swore to never touch it again. She found work in cafes, bookstores, and finally lounges. It was safer being no one. Being invisible meant no one could take anything else away from her. Now, years later, the grand piano at the Velvet Crown brought it all back. Her heart pounded against her ribs like it wanted to escape. She couldn't tell if it was fear or rage. Richard's smirk didn't fade. He thought he had power over her. Just like her father once did. Just like the reporters. The judges. The world. She clenched her fists, the tremble in her fingers betraying her stillness. The patrons waited, murmuring, a few still laughing. But not all of them. Some were watching her differently now. A few had noticed her pale face, the way her chest rose and fell like a trapped bird. The piano stood in the middle of the room like a spotlight with no mercy. She took one step toward it. Then another. Her legs felt like they were made of stone. Every step thudded in her ears like a bass drum. Richard gestured dramatically, making space for her. "Let's see what the waitress can do," he chuckled. She walked past him without a glance. Her eyes never left the piano. She could smell the polished wood. She remembered the scent. The smoothness of the keys. The way her hands once moved like they were connected directly to her soul. She sat down, rigid and uncertain, the room fading away around her. The bench creaked under her weight. Her hands hovered above the keys but didn't touch. Her breath was shallow. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy lid. That young girl with dreams too big for her own name. She closed her eyes. A memory surfaced. Her mother's voice. "When you play, don't try to impress. Just try to feel." Emily's fingers dropped onto the keys gently. She pressed a single note. It rang out, pure and soft. It was wrong. Too thin. Too bare. She stopped. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few snickers came from Richard's table. Her hands pulled back. She wanted to run. But something inside her pushed back. The girl she buried wasn't dead. Just hiding. Slowly, her fingers returned to the keys. She played another note. Then a chord. Then a broken scale that shimmered with hesitation. She wasn't performing. She was remembering. Her back straightened. Her fingers moved again, this time faster, smoother. The room quieted. The laughter died. No one expected the waitress to command silence. But Emily wasn't a waitress anymore. She was the echo of a forgotten genius waking up after years in the dark. The notes weren't perfect. But they were honest. Raw. They carried pain and beauty all tangled together. A few people lowered their phones. Some just watched, brows furrowed, caught in something they couldn't explain. Even Richard stopped smiling. He leaned forward, eyes narrow. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a joke. The waitress was playing like someone who had bled music. Someone who had buried more than a dream. As she played, her body loosened. Her fingers no longer trembled. She didn't look up, didn't speak, didn't blink. She was somewhere else now. A different world. One where there was no Richard. No velvet crown. No past. Only sound. And in that moment, the room wasn't judging her. It was listening. Really listening. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin again. The lounge was still as Emily's last note hung in the air, trembling like a secret that had just escaped. But the silence didn't last long. A single slow clap broke it, sharp and mocking, echoing through the velvet-draped room like a slap. Richard Langston stood, smirking again, his hands moving in exaggerated rhythm. His voice sliced through the moment. "Not bad," he said, dragging out the words. "Almost makes you forget she's just the help." Laughter erupted again from his corner of the room, but this time it wasn't as loud. Some guests shifted in their seats. Some weren't laughing at all. Emily's hands dropped from the keys, her breath catching again. The old ache was back. But she didn't cry. Not this time. Richard wasn't finished. "Tell me," he said, walking up beside her like a director checking a prop, "was that supposed to be a song or a sob story?" His friends chuckled, but it sounded forced. A few phones were still filming. One of the guests, a man in a white blazer near the bar, frowned and lowered his camera. Emily looked up, locking eyes with Richard for the first time. He flinched, but only slightly. "Play another one," he said, dropping the stack of money on the piano with a thud. "You've still got an audience." Emily stared at the cash. Her hands clenched in her lap. The insult wasn't just about music. It was about power. About making her a puppet on a stage she never asked to stand on. He wasn't praising her. He was daring her again, this time to beg, to dance, to become his personal show. But she didn't move. She stood instead, slowly, and turned to face the room. For a moment, she said nothing. The crowd watched her, unsure of what would happen next. Her eyes scanned the tables, pausing on the phones, the half-smiles, the people waiting for drama like they paid for it with their drinks. And then she spoke. Quietly, but clearly. "I didn't come here to perform." A murmur swept through the room. Richard raised an eyebrow. "No," he asked. "Could have fooled me." Emily shook her head. "You didn't ask me to play because you thought I had talent. You asked because you thought I'd fail." More silence. Richard's smile faltered. "But you didn't," he said, trying to regain control. "Congratulations. You proved me wrong. You can play a few pretty notes." He gestured toward the audience. "And you got their attention. That's worth something, isn't it?" His tone was laced with sarcasm. The kind that cut deeper than shouting ever could. Emily turned to leave, but he wasn't done. "Wait," he said, grabbing her wrist. Not hard, but firm. "You think you're better than all this now? You think you can just stand up and lecture me?" Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer. The pianist in her wanted to run. The waitress in her wanted to stay silent. But the part of her that had been humiliated too many times didn't want to play any role anymore. Before anyone could react, a woman from one of the side tables stood up. She looked older, elegant, dressed in navy blue with silver hair pulled into a bun. "Let go of her," she said calmly. The entire room turned toward her. Richard scoffed. "Do you know who you're talking to?" The woman didn't blink. "Yes. A man who's forgotten how to listen." Richard's face twitched. He released Emily's wrist. The woman walked forward slowly, her heels echoing softly on the floor. She looked Emily up and down, not with judgment, but recognition. "That piece you played," the woman said softly, "was your own, wasn't it?" Emily looked startled. She nodded slowly. "I heard it once before," the woman continued. "Years ago. At a youth competition. You were 13. A new wave of whispers passed through the room. Richard's face paled slightly. "That's impossible," he said. "She's just a waitress." But the woman turned to him. She was Emily Bennett. The prodigy. The girl who vanished after her father's arrest. More gasps. Someone at the bar dropped a glass. A few people opened their phones again, this time searching names. Emily Bennett. Piano prodigy. Headlines. Scandals. Photos of a smiling girl at a grand piano, trophies lining the wall. And a last photo, her in a hoodie, head down, leaving a courthouse. Richard stumbled back a step. That's ancient history, he muttered. What does that have to do with tonight? The woman's expression hardened. Everything. You didn't humiliate a waitress tonight. You tried to humiliate an artist. And she reminded you why she was unforgettable. Richard looked around. The crowd was no longer amused. Some were filming again, but not with grins. With grim expressions. Someone said his name, sharply. Another said, "You went too far." And that's when the shift happened. The same room that had laughed with him an hour ago now watched him like a stranger. Emily took a deep breath and stepped away from the piano. She didn't need to say anything else. The music had spoken for her. The woman in navy gave her a nod of respect and turned to leave. Emily followed. Richard stood alone beside the piano he used to control the night, and now stood as a symbol of his failure. His face twisted in quiet rage, but he didn't speak again. The game was over. As Emily stepped back into the shadows of the lounge, she felt the heat of the moment still clinging to her skin. She didn't return to the bar or to her station near the kitchen doors. Instead, she walked slowly along the velvet curtains that lined the back wall, letting her fingertips brush against the fabric. Her pulse was still racing, but her face was calm. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room shifting off Richard and back to her, but it didn't shake her this time. What had just happened wasn't something she planned. It wasn't part of a comeback. It was a moment born from pressure, pain, and the echo of something beautiful she thought she had buried forever. She reached a quiet corner behind a potted plant near the exit, where the noise of the lounge dimmed. She leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. The keys were still fresh on her fingers. Her mother's voice was still floating in her ears. Her past, once locked behind silent walls, had burst open like a flood. And it was more than the crowd's attention or the rich man's humiliation. It was the sound of herself waking up. Back near the piano, Richard stood frozen, trying to salvage his ego. He poured himself another glass of wine with a hand that shook slightly. His friends didn't laugh anymore. One of them looked away when their eyes met. Another excused himself to the restroom. For the first time in a long time, Richard wasn't the center of the room. The woman in navy had returned to her table, quietly speaking to a man seated beside her who looked deeply concerned. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a tailored grey suit. As he stood and approached the piano, whispers returned. Some recognized him as Oliver Grant, the owner of the Velvet Crown. He rarely made appearances during peak hours, preferring to stay in the background. But tonight, he had come down in person. He walked past Richard without a glance and headed toward Emily, who still hadn't moved from her place by the curtain. She noticed him coming and straightened her back, bracing for another confrontation. But his expression was not cruel. It was almost curious. "You played something that made the whole room stop," he said. "That doesn't happen here often." She nodded but said nothing. "That piece," he continued, "was it yours?" She nodded again. "I used to play," she said softly. "A long time ago." Oliver looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "The woman who stood up earlier, do you know her?" Emily shook her head. "No," she said. "But I think she knew me." Oliver glanced over his shoulder toward the woman, who gave a small wave of acknowledgement. "That's Margaret Vance," he said. "She's one of the directors for the National Symphony Hall. She doesn't usually speak out in public, but tonight she did." Emily's throat tightened. "Why now?" she asked. "Because you reminded people what art is supposed to feel like," he said. "Raw. Honest. Dangerous." Emily looked down. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." Oliver smiled faintly. "The best things never are." Meanwhile, Richard had stepped outside, his chest burning with embarrassment. The night air was sharp against his skin, and his breath fogged in the cold. He tried to call someone, his assistant, his lawyer, Anyone who could distract him from the fact that he had just become the villain in a story spreading across social media by the second. One of the videos had already been uploaded with the title, "Waitress Destroys Billionaire with Piano Solo." Another clip had a still image of his face with the words "when the joke backfires" in bold letters. His hands trembled. He had mocked her, set her up to fall. And instead, she'd made him irrelevant in less than 3 minutes. His fame couldn't protect him from the truth anymore. Back inside, Emily took one last look at the piano before turning away. The moment was over. The magic, the fury, the awakening, it had passed. But something in her had shifted. Something real. As she stepped toward the employee hallway, Oliver stopped her. "I'd like to offer you a position here," he said. "Not as a waitress. As a performer." Emily stared at him. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that," she said. "You already were," he replied. "You just needed someone to remind you." She thought for a moment, then shook her head. "I don't think I want to play for people who need reminding." With that, she gave him a small nod and walked away, leaving Oliver watching her with a mix of admiration and understanding. She didn't want to become part of someone else's spectacle again. Not even if it came with applause. She disappeared through the hallway door, her figure swallowed by the narrow corridor, the echo of her footsteps soft and steady. Up front, Margaret Vance had pulled out her phone and was typing rapidly. A few minutes later, her message went out to several high-ranking members of the music world. "I found her," the message read. "She's alive. She's still got it. And she's better than before." She didn't wait for replies. She just stared at the piano and the stage beyond it. Something had returned to the world that night. A light that had gone dim was shining again, not through fame or press, but through truth. The next morning, the Velvet Crown was a different place. The staff walked in with curious eyes and subtle whispers, replaying what had happened the night before like a legend passed around a campfire. Videos had gone viral. Emily's face, once lost in the shadows of a lounge, was now on screens across the city. People were talking, news outlets, musicians, and strangers from across the internet. The girl who was forced to play piano to be mocked had become something more, a symbol of grace under pressure. But what no one expected was how deep her story really went. Within hours, threads began surfacing online. Comment sections filled with speculation. "Is this the Emily Bennett from the scandal years ago?" someone asked. "She looks just like the girl who vanished after her father was arrested," wrote another. And then, the real twist arrived. An old music critic named Harold Denton posted a photo of a young Emily at a piano competition from a decade ago, side by side with a still from the lounge footage. The resemblance was undeniable. The story exploded. Comments turned into headlines. Prodigy reappears in lounge showdown. Piano scandal girl silences billionaire. The world wanted answers. While Emily avoided the spotlight, hiding in the small apartment she shared with a roommate who worked nights, others were piecing together the story for her. Margaret Vance, who had recognized Emily during her performance, released a statement confirming her identity. She explained how Emily had once been on track to become one of the youngest professional pianists in the world. She shared how Emily had disappeared after her father was caught stealing from the very sponsors funding her rise. What Margaret didn't share, but suspected, was that someone more powerful had played a part in pushing Emily away from the stage. That suspicion gained weight when a journalist named Nina Holloway began investigating Richard Langston's past. She dug through old archives, public records, and court documents. One file stood out, an old lawsuit that had been sealed just weeks before Emily's father's arrest. It involved misused funds from Langston's real estate firm, which happened to sponsor young musicians at the time. The paperwork named a man who managed the accounts, Mark Bennett, Emily's father. Nina connected the dots. If Mark had been framed or pushed to take the fall, and if Richard had a hand in burying the evidence, it would explain everything. The betrayal. The silence. The shame. But there was more. One of the entries in the file listed a payment Richard authorized directly. A payment that went missing the same week the sponsorship for Emily was withdrawn. The money had never been accounted for. With this information, Nina contacted Margaret, who in turn reached out to Oliver Grant, the lounge owner. They arranged to meet with Emily privately. When she opened the door and saw them standing there, Emily's heart sank. She wasn't ready. She didn't want to relive it all. But their eyes weren't filled with pity or judgment. Only concern. They sat down in her small kitchen, and Margaret gently placed a folder on the table. "There's more to your story than you were allowed to know," she said. Emily opened it, her fingers trembling again, but not like they did on stage. This tremble was fear of the truth. She read the documents, her lips tightening with each page. The story she had accepted for years, that her father had gambled away their life, that he had betrayed her dreams, was unraveling. He had been guilty of moving money, yes, but it was under pressure, under instruction. And Richard Langston had likely benefited the most from the outcome. Her father had gone to prison, while Richard rose higher in business and buried his role under sealed files and silence connections. Emily's hands shook as she closed the folder. "Why now?" she whispered. Margaret answered gently. "Because you played. Because you didn't let them break you. And now people are watching." Emily looked out the window, the city alive with sound. Her name was back out there, but this time, not for shame. For strength. The world knew who she was again. And this time, it was on her terms. Meanwhile, Richard was in damage control. His PR team was scrambling to write statements, threatening lawsuits against blogs spreading the story. But the problem was, it wasn't just a rumor. It was real. Nina's report was already scheduled to go live on a major news outlet by evening. The financial records were being reviewed by lawyers. One of Richard's former partners had agreed to testify. He couldn't stop it. His empire was shaking, and at the center of the storm was the woman he tried to humiliate in front of a crowd. The woman who played a piano and reopened every door he tried to seal shut. But Emily didn't want revenge. She didn't need it. Her power came from surviving, from standing, from playing that night not to win, but to remember. And she had remembered everything. In the days that followed, the storm didn't fade, it only grew louder. The lounge where it all began was now a hotspot for journalists, music fans, and even tourists who just wanted to take a picture near the infamous piano. But Emily wasn't there. She had taken a leave from her job and retreated into quiet, choosing solitude over fame. Her phone never stopped buzzing, offers from news shows, interview requests, music schools asking if she'd return. But she answered none of them. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because none of it felt right. She had lived so long in silence that noise, even good noise, felt overwhelming. What she needed was time. Not attention. Not applause. Just space to breathe. In her apartment, she sat by the window most evenings with a notebook open, not writing music, but thoughts. Feelings. Traces of who she had been, who she had become, and who she might be next. The city moved around her like it always had, busy, cold, fast. But now, she didn't feel invisible. She had faced the fire and didn't burn. And that was enough. For now. Meanwhile, Richard Langston was falling apart. His face was on the cover of every business magazine for all the wrong reasons. The scandal tied to Emily's father was under federal review. His partners were leaving. His name, once respected, was now mocked in late-night shows. But what hurt him most wasn't the business fallout. It was the video. The sound of her music. That one moment of truth he couldn't erase from his mind. He played the clip over and over in the dark, alone in his penthouse, with a drink in his hand and regret in his chest. He saw her face, calm, focused, broken and whole at once. He hated how it made him feel. Not because she beat him, but because it reminded him of the person he used to be before greed changed him. He had once played piano too. Badly, but with love. He had once respected music. But somewhere along the way, he stopped listening. He only heard himself. And now, the silence she left behind was louder than any crowd he could pay for. Eventually, he reached out. He sent her a letter. Not an email. Not a public post. A real, handwritten letter. Inside, he tried to explain himself. He apologized. Said he didn't know who she was. Said it wasn't personal. But even as he wrote it, he knew none of that mattered. Because it was personal. He had seen her as less. He had wanted to watch her fall. And she didn't. That was the real truth. Emily read the letter once. Then again. Then folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. She didn't respond. Not because she hated him, but because some apologies don't need to be answered. They just need to be heard. She knew he would carry what happened for the rest of his life. That was enough. She didn't want revenge. She didn't need his fall to feel like she had risen. Her healing didn't depend on his guilt. It depended on her peace. And she had finally started to find it. One afternoon, weeks after everything, Margaret visited again. She brought a gift, a small silver key. "What's this?" Emily asked. "A piano studio," Margaret said. "Quiet. Private. Yours, if you want it." Emily smiled softly but didn't take the key. "Maybe someday," she said. "But not yet." Margaret nodded. She didn't push. She just sat with her, sipping tea in the sunlight, two women tied by music, silence, and everything in between. That night, Emily walked by a public park and paused near a group of street performers. One of them was playing an old keyboard with missing keys. Kids danced nearby. No one was filming. No one was pretending. It was raw, messy, and beautiful. She smiled, not sad this time, but something close to free. She didn't need the world to know her name. She didn't need a stage. All she needed was that feeling, that tiny spark that said she hadn't lost herself forever. Far away, Richard sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the piano he had ordered the day after the incident. It sat untouched in his living room. Every time he thought of lifting the lid, he stopped. Because he knew he wouldn't play it. Not yet. Maybe never. The room felt cold no matter how warm the lights were. He had everything money could buy. But he had no peace. No music. Just echoes. And somewhere in the city, a waitress no longer afraid to touch a piano again was learning to forgive herself for years of silence. Not with words. But with small steps. Quiet ones. Honest ones. The kind that don't need applause to matter. The kind that slowly bring a soul back to life.